Hello, everybody. My name is Heloisa Soares. I am a GI medical oncologist at the Huntsman Cancer Institute and University of Utah, and I'm going to be discussing with you the impact on COVID-19 in clinical trials. These are my disclosures. And why this is important, and why is this important in cancer and cancer care and clinical trials? We know that the conduct of clinical trials is really part of the cancer care, and that has been really disrupted by COVID-19. If you look at some data that has been shared with us, around 1,000 organizations have reported trial disruptions, consistent with probably a decrease of 80% in new patients entering trials when you compare April of 2020 to April of 2019. Actually, if you look at some data that was recently shared in the UK, the disruption have been up to 95%. So about 95% of the clinical trials can actually had some issues with stopping enrollment. And in the United States, we know the enrollment has been really slowed or in some occasions even completely stopped. This is a little bit of more concrete data on what we have seen, and this data reflects the SWOG accruals, which is one of the cooperative groups by the NCI. And we can see here the accrual was weekly was going strong, but then February hit. In February 21st, we have the first reported documented case of COVID-19 in the United States. And then the cases were going up, and the accrual was coming down. I think most recently, and this is data that hasn't been officially published but has been shared internally, we're doing a little bit better in general. Physicians that have clinical trials in recovering accrual, I call it, we're doing better, but we're yet not back to our baseline if we compare to enrollments from late 2018 and 2019. So many investigators have looked into the impact of COVID in clinical trials. And actually, this was a publication that was done by ASCO, reporting some surveys that have been done in cancer centers. So this was called the ASCO Survey in COVID-19, and the goal was to help the cancer community learn more about the patterns of symptoms and severity of COVID-19 among patients with cancers, as well as the COVID-19 impact in delivering cancer care and patient outcomes. They sent surveys to about 64 individuals in the US through SurveyMonkey link. And this was actually done in March. The data from 32 surveys were included in this review. For you to have an idea, this is the characteristics of the participants that have been enrolled. So you can see that there was a mix. 43% of the participants are from academic cancer centers, and 56% were not, including folks in the community. In terms of the NCI funded research, that was not applicable in about 34%, but 40% were actually surveys coming from NCI designated cancer centers, another group of 28% coming from NCI community oncology research practices. In terms of who was the person that filled this survey, it was split, with most of them being done by research directors or administrators, managers, and then 43% were actually done by a physician medical director or a physician investigator, and very little by staff per se. So what was the response? Well, 64% actually reported some changes in institutional policy and clinical trials. And what I mean by that, the changes in policies were by halting and limiting or prioritizing the screening and enrollment of new clinical trials. There's also a halting, limiting, or prioritizing screening in enrolling patients in ongoing clinical trials. There is also a lot of changes in strategy to prevent patient exposure to COVID-19, including telehealth, remote consenting, patient review and report of symptoms and adverse events through patients' portals, web, video, and so forth. trying to ship oral drugs to patients directly, incorporating the use of local labs, restricting extra visitors, stopping the access of sponsors and CROs and monitors or vendors to in-person visits to the cancer centers. Remote visiting for monitoring and site initiations were also incorporated, and allowing for staff to work remotely, and also prohibiting staff travel for business. So here is another way to represent this, and you can see that really the percentage of this was incorporated in this cancer centers that were doing clinical trials. Remote patient report of symptoms was extremely high in the incorporation of that using portal, email, or phone. 90% of the folks that answered the survey. Initiation of telehealth visits, 87%. Remote working from the staff, 75%. Site initiations are also become remotely in many places. Here, the stats was 65%. Prioritization of enrolling in some clinical trials are 50%, and so forth. And you can see a list of other things that we can see that they were adapted because of COVID. What are the greatest challenges that COVID brought to conducting clinical trials? Well, there was a decrease in patient ability or willingness to come to the site, and this was seen in 54% of for the sites. Time spending organizing and conducting telehealth visits, although it sounds extremely simple, is not, as probably you know, especially in the beginning, it was very hard to figure out what was the best platform to do a telehealth visit, and some were HIPAA compliant, some were not. Patients were not adapted to technology, and there was a lot of teaching curve from the staff, but also from patients to learn how to use and be comfortable with telehealth. There was also a limited amount of ancillary services if someone needed a colleague to see the patient, because the trial was, let's say, requiring that a dermatology visits, and now our colleagues from dermatology were no longer available. There's a lot of time spent also in discussing with IRB and sponsors what could be done to modify the clinical trials to make them be easier in the era of COVID. Also, as mentioned, reduction of the staff availability, either because they were working from home and they're not available, or because they were calling sick because of a health issue, or even because they just had kids at home. And homeschooling, as many of you know, is extremely challenging to many families. Protocol compliance was also an issue. And I don't want to minimize the decrease in patient interest and willingness to enroll, because clinical trials typically come with much more frequent visits and more lab work many times, and that could be less appealing for patients that want to minimize exposure. So what were the other challenges that have been reported in this survey? Well, there was a concern about financial burden that downtown will place to the organization. Many organizations have reportedly lost financial losses with COVID. Struggles with remote monitoring with staff working from home, inefficient technology to perform jobs the way that they should be expected to be performed, limited of drug supplies and other supplies related to research, inconsistent prioritization of research by some physicians and staff, and not even less important, staff anxiety, right? Either from faculty or from the staff, which is also very important, and well-being is extremely important. So what are the strategies that were suggested to perform and conduct clinical trials during the COVID era? I think ensure open communication, keep participants informed about the changes in the trials and their care, and make sure to communicate also with the research staff, organize this daily staff huddles and video conferences well, so everybody knows what to expect. Communicate any changes quickly to the IRBs to avoid any problems in the future and deviations. Also, I think we quickly learned about implementing formal COVID-19 SOPs. The sooner we do that, the easier it was for everybody. Including from the procedures that they in clinic for whoever the staff is, to prioritizing the clinical trial resource allocations and be extremely transparent about that, ensure documentation of the changes and modifications and deviation forms, and so forth. And also simplify and leverage the technology. Many of us that conduct clinical trials had incorporated e-signatures, so the need for paper signatures and being in touch with people decreased, and actually was something that made some of the processes be much faster, promote the telehealth when allowable, and implement this patient review of symptoms and adverse events via phone, video, email, and even the patient portal. Allow for monitoring visits and site initiation visits from distance. Sometimes now, if possible, allow for local labs to be used, so the patients didn't have to travel for specific labs that are needed for the trial, particularly if they were otherwise a standard of care, or just a question of the timing of the lab collection. Sending the drugs, if they were oral, to patients' home, and obviously developing frequent asked questions to the monitors and sponsors that will facilitate, again, this everyday dynamics that we have when we are conducting a clinical trial. So what are the opportunities for improvement that came up and we think we can be used post the COVID-19 era? So the majority of the folks that answered the survey suggested that indeed telehealth should stay. More than 90% of the surveys encourage that. Remote patient reporting review of the systems should also stay. Remote site initiation visits was also something that they felt that should stay after COVID, as well as CRO and sponsor monitoring, particularly if your healthcare system allows for that. Epic, for example, is one healthcare system that has a mechanism that this monitor and audit visits can done remotely. And again, remote labs could be something to use as well. And I think we should not forget about designing smarter trials, remote consenting, adverse events assessments, less collection of unnecessary data, right? That's something that sometimes we collect a lot of data that we're not using. Perhaps now we are more conscious about that and should start designing trials that are smarter in that sense. Modification of procedures that will make things simpler. Teleworking, to some extent, can be incorporated after, hopefully, COVID is in the past, and improvement in IRB communications and responses as well. In light of all these changes and many asking the FDA to come up with some guidance, this was published by the FDA back in March of 2020 and has just been updated in September of 2020. And this is the link. This is a large document, so I'm not going to be in the, go into detail, but I wanted to really highlight that there is a FDA guidance in conducting clinical trials during the COVID emergency that you can refer to. And here are some of the topics that have been addressed. For instance, in deciding whether to suspend, continue, or initiate a clinical trial, I can tell you that in our institution, particularly when the numbers were extremely high for our state, and in the very beginning where we don't know which direction we're going, we decided that if a phase 3 trial that had standard of care that was appropriate, which should be since it was a phase 3, we probably would favor patients going to the standard of care other than offer in the clinical trial. However, we did not necessarily stop enrollment and phase 1 trials for which patients really didn't have any other options, or there was biomarker driven, there was a good opportunity. So it was a little bit of a case by case, but we developed in my institution some suggestions for that. Another, for example, here, conducting remote and virtual visits in clinic, the FDA had a position about that. And indeed, we did adopt it, particularly for the visits that were, we wouldn't necessarily do if we were doing standard of care, and the patient was receiving otherwise in a trial, but receiving standard of care. We converted some of these visits for virtual visits and took a quote unquote minor deviation from the NCI. I'm mentioning NCI trial as an example, and so forth. So you can see, you can go through the list and see that the FDA thought about all these options and had recommendations for all of them. The next thing that I want to talk about is about the NCI sponsored trials for COVID. So when you look at the NCI webpage, and I listed in the bottom here, the page, we see 31 trials that the NCI supports. And I just wanted to highlight some. There are many trials that are focusing in symptom management. For example, this first trial that I highlighted is remote COVID symptom tracking and improvement of cancer symptom control in patients with cancer at home during the pandemic. This is the link and number of the trial. There's also this trial about mobile health application of monitor symptoms in COVID with cancer patients. That's actually trial led by one of our investigators at Huntsman Cancer Institute. Here's the link for that. Also, I want to mention the NCI COVID-19 longitudinal study in cancer patients, the NCAP study. I'll talk about this study a little bit more in a second. But in addition to all this, we do have some trials with experimental interventions. And here I highlighted 2 trials that are ongoing on that you can take a look. So the NCAPS trial, or this COVID-19 longitudinal study, what was the goal of this study? So this study was is a large study that hopes to accrue a little bit more than 2,000 patients. These patients have to be patients undergoing cancer therapy or had just recently completed anti-cancer therapy. And the idea is to capture the patients that are positive for COVID. And also monitor the severity of the symptoms. All the NCI sites can participate it, and the goal was to assess the outcomes of COVID-19 in areas that have high, moderate, or lower prevalence of COVID. Also, the goal is to understand the difference in terms of gender and minorities outcomes when you think about COVID. Also collect data whether or not there was modifications in cancer treatment made because of COVID-19. Evaluate the association between COVID-19 and cancer outcomes, and focus on particular subgroups. Assess anti-SARS-CoV-2 antibodies development, cytokine abnormalities, and genetic pleomorphisms associated with the severity of COVID-19, and create a bank of clinical data, research blood specimens, and radiology images for the future. So this is a schema of the trial. You could be enrolled in this trial at 2 stages. If there was a suspicious for COVID, you could considering consenting the patient upfront under stage 0. And if the patients were positive for COVID, they will be continued and followed through the course of 2 years if they accept to be on this study. If they were negative, the patient participation will finish. But also, if you miss that initial timing of potentially consenting the patient, there is also opportunity to enroll the patient in the study if after you know that the patient is positive for COVID-19. And then there's different algorithms to whether the patient is in the outpatient setting or whether the patient is in the inpatient setting. If the patient is actually hospitalized, it's quite an involving study in terms of collecting data and entering the data for the patients. And what data is being collected? So it's being collected data again in the pre-existing conditions and comorbidities, cancer types and treatments, demographic factors, COVID-19 course, and whether or not the patient stay in the hospital and for how long. They're also requesting that the sites that are participating in enrolling patients send to the NCI the imaging related to the patients, both related to cancer and also related to COVID-19. And finally, there's a bunch of correlative biomarkers that will be studied. That's why patients are required to submit some blood samples through the course of 2 years, obviously more intensely in the first month or so after COVID. And then they're going to be checking for antibodies, cytokine abnormalities, and either considering some gene-wide association studies. So I hope this is an overview about how COVID-19 has impacted clinical trial, as well as some of the clinical trials and research in cancer that has been done, not necessarily for COVID-19 in general. I'm not an infectious disease doctor, but I want to just highlight some of the studies that have been done focusing cancer patients in COVID-19. And, this was a nice publication that on Cancer Cell that just come up earlier last month, actually, and they highlight all the impacts. So you can see, can start with our personal stress, including occupational risk associated of acquiring COVID, concerns with the use of PPE, family concerns, either because there's a ill family member or because of homeschooling. Raise your hand if you're having trouble homeschooling your kids, or even if they're at school, there are still some challenges. Then there is concerns with patient care, and they can be in terms of when to test the patients, navigate treatment decisions. So for example, I had a patient with gastroesophageal cancer undergoing curative intent chemo radiation, and the patient tested positive during the course of that. What do I do? The patient is committed with the radiation and the chemotherapy, and this is curative intent. Should I keep it or should not keep it, right? Challenge with telehealth, clinical trials that we talk, visitor policies, is not the great experience to have an end-of-life discussion either via the internet or when the patient is alone with no family members to give support. There is issues with research in general that are also a problem, and we talk a lot. Also, the idea of meeting our colleagues in person to brainstorm about research has shifted. Now we have this significant amount of video conferences, and that causes a lot of fatigue, right? Many joke that's the Zoom fatigue, but also limits our ability to do networking, which is so important to generate ideas for further research. And finally, there's going to be challenges with funding. We already know the philanthropic funding has decreased. There are fewer foundation grants, and the NCI is reviewing and revising how they're going to be funding research moving forward. So 2019 and COVID definitely changed clinical research and cancer care. Hopefully for not too long more, and hopefully we will learn and do better in the future. I would like to thank you for listening to this talk, and I think now we're going to jump to questions. Thank you.